Hello everyone. Today I'm going to do a video that my friend requested. She asked me, were the early Irish in colonial America slaves? And the answer to that is no. Now, when I say no, that does not mean they were mistreated and used like slaves. They just were not slaves. The vast majority of Irish that came to colonial America, early colonial America, were indentured servants. Now, for those who don't know, an indentured servant was someone who sold their labor, and in this case, they sold their labor for a passage on a ship. You had a lot of plantation owners and big farmers in colonial America that had tons of land, but not enough people to till the land and farm the land. So they would pay the passage of these poor Europeans and also promised them room and board while they were here, and usually at the end of their servitude they would get land and goods to start their new life in return for a term of service which was between 2 and 7 years. Usually it was about 4. Now, when I say they weren't slaves, that doesn't mean their lives were easy. The passage over to America alone was horrific. Imagine being on an airline packed in like sardines for 3 months. So these shipping companies were trying to make a profit, so they put as many people into the ship as they could, just like an airline does, and the food was horrible and spoiled, and the water was black and horrible. They ran into storms. It was a terrible voyage, and many indentured servants died on the voyage over. And when they got here, their life didn't improve very much. In general, the conditions of indentured servants were similar to slaves. They were put in substandard housing, they didn't get enough food, they died of disease, oftentimes they died of mistreatment from their owners. It was estimated that only 40% of indentured servants made it to the end of their indenturitude, made it to freedom. But that being said, they did have rights that African slaves did not have. First of all, they were considered people, Christian people. They were considered the lowest rung of Christian people, but they were still considered people. African slaves were not considered people. We know this from a lot of the court records that we have. When a slave was sold, there was usually no name on it, just an age and a price. When an indentured servant's contract was sold, it usually said Mary Smith's contract is being sold to so-and-so. The indentured servants also had rights of the court system. They were able to go to court. There's an example of a man who was hung up by his wrists, and then lit cigarettes were put on all his knuckles. And he lost the use of some of his knuckles from this, but he was able to go to court, and this was in the Bahamas, the worst place for Irish to go. And the judge immediately freed him, gave him compensation, and put the people that did it to him in jail. An African slave would have no recourse. The owners could do whatever they wanted to them, and there would be no repercussions. The Irish were allowed to join militias and be armed. The African slaves were only allowed in the militias in emergencies, and then they were not allowed to be armed. They could only have clubs, and then those clubs were taken away from them as soon as the emergency was over. A lot of times the Irish and indentured servants would mete out the punishment to the African slaves if the African slaves misbehaved, so the whippings would be done by the indentured servants. There was a law in, I can't remember the island, but one of the islands of the Bahamas, that if a indentured servant caught a African slave stealing, they could kill them with no repercussions. Actually, they would be rewarded with, I think it was like 90 pounds of sugar. The work that they did was similar. Like we imagine colonial America, and especially early colonial America, of a plantation owner with a whole bunch of African slaves working the fields. This was not the case in early colonial America. It was actually more indentured servants with a sprinkling of African slaves. The African slaves became more and more prominent as time went on for economic reasons. The plantation owners had a hard time finding people to indenture themselves as time went on, and they found it to be economically more viable to hold slaves, because a slave, you could get 50 years of service out of that slave, and any children that that slave had you also owned and could service off of them. An indentured servant, by law, had to be freed after 5 years, sometimes even less, and in addition you had to give them goods at the end of their service, so it cost you more money. And an indentured servant's children were not slaves. They were free. Now, there's a little bit of an exception with females here. Females that got pregnant, if you were an indentured servant and you got pregnant in that time period, usually you had time put onto your servitude. And the reason why the owners did this was they thought that women were trying to get out of working by getting pregnant. Now the irony is that many times it was the owners of the plantation and their families that would impregnate the indentured servants, but that didn't matter. It was still the woman's fault for getting pregnant. It was a bad system all around. Now, indentured servitude, not many people know this, wasn't banished until 1865, after the Civil War. It just moved into disuse because they moved into the slavery system. Like I said, it was more economically viable. So no, the Irish were mistreated terribly. They were in almost every way mistreated, and even after they were freed and got land, they would get land in the mountains. If you notice in historical records, a lot of the mountainous regions of the original colonies were settled by Irish settlers, and that was because a lot of the indentured servants would get land that their owners didn't want. They're like, oh, here's your property on the side of a mountain, enjoy. But they were able to scratch out a living and freed, and many of their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and their descendants built America, while African slaves had to wait another 200 years for most of them to be freed and start the same process. And that's about all. Remember, never to believe in anybody's propaganda, not even your own. And if you like this video, like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye-bye.